Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to this final session of the day. It's wonderful to see you all here, and our panel is the only thing between you and a drink before dinner tonight, so we'll move this along. This is the resilience stream, one of the three streams that we're operating here at the conference. And this afternoon our subject is social licence for national security. What's the mandate? What a wonderful subject to be closing this first day with, and it reflects very strongly on the comments that were made by Rory this morning in his opening address about the importance of engaging with the Australian community around issues related to national security. I am indeed a Professor of Practice here at the National Security College, and it's my very great pleasure to be your moderator this afternoon. It's my privilege to be able to welcome our panel, a very distinguished panel here this afternoon. I'll introduce each of the panellists in order that they are going to speak. I want to just make the point that each of the panellists have invested in the issue of social licence, and their comments will, I'm sure, provoke quite a deal of conversation and perhaps some heavy thinking for you individually. The first panellist this afternoon is James Brown. James is well known across the national security and public policy space. He's the chair of Invictus Australia, the Invictus Australia board. He's not long finished as the CEO of the Space Industry Association of Australia. And he served as a military officer with distinguished overseas operational service. And in 2017, memorably, he became the youngest ever elected president of the Returned Services League of Australia and turned that organisation in a couple of years in a very much needed direction. James, welcome. Secondly, we have Di Lee, MP. Di is the independent federal member for Fowler. And after a career in journalism, Di was elected to Parliament in 2022. Di is notably the first refugee and Vietnamese-born Australian to be elected to Parliament. Quite a remarkable thing. Thirdly, we have Christian Fjäder. Christian has had a distinguished career in the Finnish government as the Director for Policy Planning and Analysis at the Finnish National Emergency Supply Agency. He was a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and he's currently in the private sector where he's the CEO of a company, Geostrategic Limited, which is a risk resilience research and advisory company. I'm very keen to hear Christian's view from the Finnish side of what national resilience, what the issue of social licence means in Finland, because it's a country to which, as many of you know, we turn from time to time for inspiration and comparison and some thoughts. And while the circumstances are different, we're very anxious to hear about the Finnish experience around social licence. The next speaker is Lisa Singh. Lisa, welcome. Following a distinguished career in politics, Lisa was a senator in the federal parliament. Prior to that, she was a member of the Tasmanian Parliament and indeed a minister in that jurisdiction. Lisa is now the CEO of the Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne. She is also the co-chair of the Australian-India 1.5 track leadership dialogue and is on the board of both AsiaLink and Beyond Blue. And finally, we've got Dr. James Mortensen. James is a lecturer here at the ANU in the National Security College. He's an important member of our team. You'll see that his field of research and expertise covers off very nicely against the subject matter this afternoon. He has researched fields in political security, technology and social control, and the security implications of climate change. So these matters that James has been studying and pursuing will throw some interesting light on some of the discussion this afternoon. I just want to make a few remarks myself before handing over to the members of the panel. The subject, social licence for national security. What is the mandate? In a democratic society, as we all know, the first responsibility of government, this is often used as a mantra, is providing for the defence, the security of the country, and the prosperity and well-being of the people. That's undisputed. We understand that. The expected level of protection, however, that a community has is often a matter of contest, with resources allocated not necessarily meeting the aspiration, and there is quite a deal of discussion about where the midpoint lies in that, and this is where the point of social licence sort of appears. The way in which this contest is managed best by a government seeking from the community a social licence. There are large sums of money involved inevitably in this business, and for a government to convince its community, the community that it represents, that these large sums of money should be spent is often a matter of debate. Now, no one's pretending this is easy. National security is unquestionably a net cost to the society, and the community must be convinced that the threats and the needs to respond appropriately to those threats are in balance. I would put to you that when geostrategic circumstances shift, as they very clearly have in the last 7 to 10 years, that when that shift occurs, there needs to be a shift in the way in which the government and the community start addressing the issues of their challenge. A government must, in my view, immediately begin a conversation with the community to get both understanding of the situation and an acceptance of the need to spend the resource, to expend national treasure on security. There's a number of questions that come up, and many of you will be familiar with these. There's the question of securing what. I think that's always a question to be asked. What is it precisely we're securing? There's the question of government communications and how effective those communications are. The community trust in government, and Rory mentioned this morning the need for a government to share more of the knowledge that it has about the security situation in which we sit, to share more with the community. That will build the trust. Social cohesion, I'm sure we'll speak more about that. Lead times, there was a time when I was the Secretary of the Department of Defence, we always talked about a 10, 15, 20-year lead time, strategic lead time. That, of course, is evaporated, and that sort of conversation is fanciful in the current circumstance. The size and the agility of the industrial base. Are we going it alone, or are we operating in an alliance environment? And then finally, the issue of the resilient community, or the resilience of the critical infrastructure that supports that community. So they're the kind of things that are floating around. I'm going to stop talking at this point. I want to turn now to the panel. Each panellist is going to speak for 5 minutes. I have a bell here, which I found to my amusement this morning is silenced. It's a mute bell. It doesn't actually ring. It's fantastic. That saves me from the embarrassment of gonging each of the speakers. But I've told them I will lift it up. But 5 minutes from each speaker. At the end of that, I'll then turn to you, the audience, and invite you to pose questions. I'll broker that and take the questions as best I can. Could you please make your questions short and very to the point, particularly if you move to make a comment. If you could please keep it reasonably short and focused, and then we'll direct it across the panel and get answers for you. And then I'll come back at the end and try and capture some of the conversation that we've had. So with that remark, or those remarks having been made, I turn to James. James, thank you.
Duncan, thanks very much for the kind introduction. And like you, thrilled to be on this panel. And I think we've got a really broad set of experiences and skill sets here, which will give us a very rich discussion. I thought I might just step through some of our institutions and how I see them, sort of run the ruler over how I see them contributing to the social licence for national security and particularly defence at the moment. I was struck by two comments in the discussion this morning on what has been a really great day of interesting insights from the full spectrum. And that's what I like about what the National Security College does. One comment by the Secretary of Defence, Greg Moriarty, who reminded us that what they're trying to do at the moment is bring in long-range weapons that can strike an enemy at distance from Australia. That's a big part of what the Department of Defence is trying to do. And the second comment from the same panel, from Huang Letu, who was saying capability and will are the two necessary ingredients for deterrence. And so in my thinking for this panel, I've been thinking not only do we need a social license to build the capability, that's the license to spend or invest, depending on how you see these huge sums of money and the political support required to contribute them to national security, but also take them away from other parts of our society. But secondly, we need to think about how social license underpins the will to use that force. So a license to spend, and without wanting to be too crass and direct about it, a license to kill. We are building long-range weapons to strike an enemy at distance from Australia's shores. So the logical next step in our thinking about that is that future cabinets will be presented with the dilemma of when and how to use lethal military force to strike at an enemy at range, and potentially, given the velocity of conflict and technology, very quickly. As the Secretary of Defence reminded us this morning, in Australia, in an outsized way, that falls to the Prime Minister to make that decision amongst Cabinet. So that means not only do Prime Ministers need to be assured of that social licence to use lethal force, but acting Prime Ministers need to have not only that skill set, but that assurance too. So as we step through this discussion, I sort of want to keep that in mind, because that's what all these discussions are driving to potentially in the worst case. I think one of the most stunning developments in social licence for national security is represented here at the ANU. In the last 7 years, we've seen a transformation in the way our universities contribute to the national security debate. I worked at the University of Sydney 7 years ago. Hosting a conference like this with such a rich discussion is something that I would have approached with a degree of trepidation. There wasn't a lot of engagement between the academy and the national security community. And I think on both sides, we've seen a quantum leap where not only technology thinkers and scientists are contributing to our national security endeavour, but importantly, the humanities are too. And that's come about from a lot of discussions and a lot of effort from people, to the point where the G8 put a submission into the last Defence Review, articulating all the ways that they can contribute to Australia's national security effort. And I think that is a huge change, very welcome, doesn't reduce the need for dissent from our academy, but shows that we're bringing a lot more voices into the national security debate as well. I think Parliament has improved its ability to generate social licence to support national security. We've seen a broader effort from our Parliament to educate itself on national security. Rory's team run educative sessions for parliamentarians on the concepts and debates in national security. The Parliamentary Library does a great job. We've now got a Defence Committee who is empowered to look more closely at defence issues and has a greater ability to access classified information. I'm somebody who believes very strongly that the Parliament needs greater powers when it comes to decisions on war and national security, and perhaps we might talk a little bit more about that further into the discussion. I still think Parliament has a way to go in terms of how it's accountable for decisions on the military use of force and elsewhere. Defence itself, Defence I would give a mixed to middling report card on their ability to generate social licence. And I don't mean to sound too critical. I know they've got a lot on the plate. But I think there are a couple of areas where Defence really needs to improve. More spending, more importance of national security means a greater demand for transparency from the public. If a ship captain gets relieved from their duty in the South China Sea, the public's going to want to know why, and they're going to want to know why pretty quickly. And it's on Defence to explain what is going on, to be accountable for the funds and the responsibility that they have. And I think that is going to require Defence to go even further in the way it thinks about transparency and communications with the public, and it's going to require a bit of a change to the way they operate. And the other key marker for how well Defence is tracking on its social licence is how many people are joining the Defence Force. At the moment, we know that numbers for recruitment are much lower than targets, and certainly much lower than the targets that we have set for future years. That tells you a bit about society if we're struggling to get citizens to join the Defence Force, even to the point where we're now having discussions about potentially creating units from the Pacific Islands who can help to contribute to our manpower shortage. And finally, I'd say two things. I think where we have the greatest effort to make in terms of generating social license for national security is in business and the economy. ESG still rules, and I think we need to be, with a much louder voice, asking what is unethical about contributing to the national security of your country. Why is security not part of ESG? Why are there so many obstacles to banks and companies and financial institutions supporting Australian companies who are contributing to the national security effort, even if they're not operating at the sharpest end of the spectrum? And the last point I'd make is the context in which we're having this discussion. One of the terms of reference for the Strategic Defence Review unearthed last year was to look at how Australia mobilises for conflict. Now, the word mobilisation didn't appear anywhere in the document, but it has appeared in a number of speeches afterwards and a number of initiatives and discussions afterwards. It's very clear that the government is not talking about mobilisation, but it is thinking, planning and acting on it. And that lifts the bar for social licence. We are talking about a national security effort that requires us to mobilise parts of our economy, to shift the lever to defence. That is very, very significant, and you don't want to be dropping that on people cold. Thanks very much.
James, thank you. Dolly.
Thank you so much, Duncan, and thank you, Rory, for having me here. It's a privilege and an honour to be sitting here and speaking with you about social licence. I suppose from my perspective, I'll be talking not from a defence and military perspective, but I can talk about food. I can talk about from the perspective of obviously transition to renewable energy, migration, population. As a pretty reasonably newly elected member of Parliament representing Western Sydney, I really engage with my community, and I reach out to them to take them on the journey and the decisions I make and why I make them, and I engage with them. I think often our leaders turn to what I would describe as virtue signalling in their policy announcements and media releases, and somehow see these as their drivers for change. And in an increasingly social media-driven world, creating clickbaits, headline-grabbing announcements only drive communities' disenchantments with politics, politician, and government. It certainly makes it harder for social licence to be developed, and it leaves many communities behind and creates inequity. I know that James talked about Parliament and government having social licence, and I just mentioned before, I think speaking to Catherine, that I think in our educated class, we talk about social licence, but I think out there in the community, often people feel very much disconnected from the decisions we make as leaders and legislators. So take, for example, the energy policy. What's in our national interest? And I believe in, of course, energy, diversity of energy resources, and not just put our eggs into one basket. I, for one, would not support, for instance, the no gas stance taken by many of my crossbench colleagues for the simple reason that my small business community relies on gas to keep many of their family-run food businesses going. So why aren't we talking about, say, biogas as an alternative, for example, which I have been informed would also meet our net emissions targets? And as someone who's embraced and adopted renewable energy, I understand the importance of this technology and energy source which we have so much in Australia, which is the sun. But yet, are we thinking about renewable energy infrastructure the old way and not the new way? Why are we building a city of solar panels, for instance? Why are we looking at a decentralized model rather than a centralized model, which is the old way, which is where our coal-powered stations operated? And in an increasingly complex and challenging area of, say, national security, from food, energy transition, migration, defence, taxation, having social licence is paramount. But it has to start with our leaders, in particular our government, taking action to make decisions differently, to engage with diverse expertise and thinking, to think outside the box, to be bold, and to not let the 3-year election cycle determine policies, priorities, and our questions of a national security. I believe the growing crossbench numbers that are starting to make a dent into the two-party system, and I personally believe that the two-party system is a hindrance to enabling diverse thinking, diverse lived experiences, and diverse perspectives to be employed. Therefore, the bipartisan system probably worked when Australia was a monoculture and was predominantly catering for an Anglo-Celtic and Anglo-Saxon nation. But today, where nearly a quarter of the population either have one parent or two parents born overseas, that this partisanship and groupthink can hinder thorough examination of policy and decision-making processes for a more diverse and productive multicultural society. The challenge is for the government and parliamentarians to shift the focus away from furthering political agendas from a two-party system and aiming for efficient and productive dialogue in a more diverse parliament to build social license for a multicultural Australia. And that's so that Australia has clarity of where we sit in the world. I believe the federal government needs to make greater effort to work jointly with local, state and private sectors to unlock social license. So while we talk a lot about social license, I believe it is, like I said again, very much in a very elite class. It's not out there in the grassroots, in the community. The government's ability to listen to the voices of our community and other government levels remains my key concern. As legislators, we create policies and strategies often in a bubble and in the hope of creating major initiatives to protect the best interests of our people. Am I up already? It's still more to go. However, the government inability to adopt a social license approach highlights the potential consequences of ignoring dialogue and communication through debates, community engagements, and authentic conversations. Although the government has made some positive steps in addressing the community's concerns on some policies aspects, such as the Stage 3 tax cuts, the government is still struggling to attain ongoing political and popular support. Long-term uncertainty of government policy and budgets has made it fairly difficult to adopt a social license approach. As I mentioned, a 3-year electoral cycle is one of the challenges, and certainly it's the shortest in the world, and so this uncertainty makes it very difficult for government to have, I think, true social license in making bold decisions. Reflecting on my recent parliamentary sitting legislation of the Migration Amendment, for example, Removal and Other Measures Bill 2024, it was rushed through within 2 days in Parliament. And while there might be justification, it didn't give us time to consult and engage with our community in terms of these major changes to our migration policy. So it is my belief that, and I go back to the media, it has a very important role to play. They act as a channel between the government and the public. It is their role to engage with public opinions and give them a platform to the voice to concerns or support of policies introduced by the government. In the same way, the media is a source of news for the public so they can be informed of the changes in legislation and policies that affect them. Yet, despite their integral role in engaging with communities, there are concerns around the trustworthiness and integrity of media to report news without interests or agendas that can adversely affect the government's capacity to ensure our national security. I'll cut it short. I'm well aware that social license, done right, is expensive. It takes a long time and requires the right kind of expertise, which is why I think thank you to Rory and Duncan for putting together this summit, a conference to bring together a wide-ranging cross-section of experts' voices and perspectives to ensure the power of a true social license is clearly understood in our democratic society today. Thank you.
Di, thank you very much for those comments. Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Duncan. I'm also very thankful just to be here and part of this discussion, but in fact, just being here in Australia again as well. So very thankful for this opportunity. Now, I was thinking in terms of how to actually crunch a totally different sort of approach to national security into 5 minutes. And I thought I'd maybe start with a shocker. We don't talk about social license in Finland in terms of national security. Why? Because we have a system, a comprehensive sort of approach to national security, which basically boils down to the sort of idea that national security is actually a shared mission, a shared duty. So we don't see our citizens as sort of subjects of national security, but participants in it. And it's not only sort of a right for people to enjoy security, but actually they have a duty to participate in it. So both actually in Finland and Sweden, for instance, this is sort of inscribed in legislation that all residents of Finland and Sweden actually are expected to participate in national security. I know it sounds quite radical, but really, if you think about our societies, first of all, they are very sort of diverse. There's a lot of the capabilities, a lot of the sort of capacities that we actually require for national security do not reside with the government. Rather, they are actually in the sort of the business sector, the non-governmental organizations, civic and volunteer organizations, and the people themselves. So it makes a whole lot of sense to actually try to harness those capabilities to provide more effective national security. And the threat environment is also much more difficult, much more diverse than it has been before. And we're seeing that clearly the sort of geostrategic situation, especially, of course, in our neighborhood, is in a great transition. So this sort of participatory approach to security where citizens are not just informed of what the objectives of national security are, what the sort of intended outcomes of it are, having been sort of living and participating in national security, they're more up to date. They have more deeper understanding of what's actually required and why. So basically, as you know, Finland and Sweden had long-term policies of being military non-aligned until Russia actually invaded Ukraine in February 22. Now, still in December 2021, only 24% of the population actually supported NATO membership. 4 days after the invasion, that sort of number had already grown north of 50%. And by May, when both applied to NATO membership, it was already well over 75% and actually climbed to over 80%. Why I'm sort of pointing out this is, of course, that in this type of sudden transformative shocks, if you just sort of try to inform your population, it's already too late. But when you have a population that has actually actively participated in the process and dialogues in national security, they just have the capability very quickly grasp in terms of what is going on. And in this case, for instance, why NATO membership was the correct solution for security in Finland and Sweden. So I think that's sort of a good example, but then just in general also, if we think in terms of protecting, for instance, critical infrastructures, critical services, critical production, sort of these processes and resources and processes that provide all the basic needs of the population. Again, it's impossible to do if we just sort of harness government resources, government capabilities to do that. So the approach, the comprehensive security approach, is all about how do you actually not just inform, not just consult people, but how do you actually involve them, provide them with the sort of capabilities and opportunities to participate as fully as possible. But maybe let's just leave it here for now.
Christian, thank you very much. Lisa.
Thank you, Duncan. Is that on?
Yeah. Is that what?
It's wonderful to be on this panel moderated by you, but also with the rest of the esteemed panel members, but also to Rory Metcalf and the National Security College team for providing such a rich program. It has so far been wonderful, and we've got a whole nother day yet to go. I think if we talk about social license and national security, we have to start from the premise of what sort of nation we are, the essence of Australia. And that is a country, what is our national identity? It's a country that is very diverse. We are, of course, a rich multicultural society, but our diversity spans a lot more than that. We have, obviously, religious diversity, gender diversity, diversity in abilities. All of that needs to be taken into account when we look at national security policy and how we engage with communities, particularly also, as Di pointed out, that something like 27% of Australians are born overseas. And some of those, of course, come from are refugees that come from war-torn conflicts or grew up in such conflicts. So I think it's with that sort of rich tapestry as a premise that we, acknowledge the backgrounds of all of us as individual citizens, and that our nation therefore demands that our policy making reflects that national identity of diversity. Which brings us obviously to the question of how do we ensure that those diverse voices are heard in the national security conversation? And to answer that, I think we cannot separate out our security from our national identity as a democracy, as a multicultural society, and all the diversity that I've just outlined. So when we think about mechanisms to consult, we need to recognise it is not a one-way street. It is not just about a national security agency educating the public. It's got to be a two-way flow of consultation. It's got to be an information flow of ideas. I think it requires feedback between community, government, and other stakeholders. So that's why I was excited to hear Rory this morning share that in fact the National Security College are going to go on the road, on a road show, and play that actual role of ensuring that community consultations are part of a sort of future agenda for Australia in the national security space. Really quite enlightening. I think through that, greater community awareness occurs. Of course, that is essential to be prepared for the challenges that our world faces and continues to face. Informing the public about the sorts of strategic risks that our nation has to prepare for, but also to listen and to engage. And through listening and engaging, then our national security agencies can adapt their policies and be more accountable to the people in the process. I don't think we should look at our national security policies as static. They do need to adapt with the changing nature, obviously, of our times, but also of the community's expectations. And, I think consulting, addressing diversity amongst us are important ways to do that. Now, getting back to mechanisms, I want to raise the issue of technology, because I do think there are a lot of positives around the use of technology and how we go about consulting on national security. Particularly when we're talking about Australia, we have a very big landmass. So, Rory's got his work cut out for him and his team and a lot of kilometres to travel. So how can we use technology in this space, particularly getting to some of the most regionally remote parts of the nation or to diaspora communities where English is not necessarily a first language? I want to use the example of what the Indian government has done through the use of an app to forge better connections amongst its culturally diverse population. Now, India is a country that has something like 22 official languages, let alone over 100 or more unofficial. Last year, Prime Minister Modi utilised this Bahasini app during a Tamil event in Varanasi to allow the Tamil-speaking attendees, primarily obviously from southern India, to receive real-time translations of his Hindi speech that he was giving to enhance connectivity amongst diverse linguistic communities. That is a positive use of technology. I know when we're talking about national security, there are a lot of pitfalls, however, with technology, and we know that it can be used by foreign actors to interfere with our own national security. And I think on that, I'll note that India itself banned TikTok for that very reason. But I think with our new national defence strategy coming out, there is an opportunity to look a little bit laterally, a little bit more broadly about how we really are going to consult and engage on national security issues in this country. I'll talk a bit more about the role of Parliament if someone asks me a question later.
Let's set that one up very well, Lisa. Thank you very much. James.
Thanks, Duncan, and thanks everybody for taking the time, especially given, I'd like to think, everyone's raving about the success of today. Congratulations, Rory. Congratulations, everybody. But, on the basis of the importance of coming together to find some common ground and find common basis on which to move forward. And that's really what I want to concentrate on in my little 5 minutes. To be honest, I thought in doing so I'd sort of be cast adrift, but given the comments from my distinguished colleagues, maybe not so much. Talking about an evaluation of what Parliament, how Parliament generates social license and activates it, our assumptions, or maybe a lack of critical assumptions on how bipartisanship might work and what it might how it might function for us. The importance of participation, which, if I may, and Christian, genuinely, please give me a nod if I'm getting this wrong, participation as a function of understanding, that a citizenry can understand what it is that they're doing, or understanding security as the nation, the essence, getting to what the essence of the nation is. Because what I was planning on doing, friends, was being a bit of a academic and just causing problems. I was going to suggest that social license as a practical, ephemeral thing, absolutely, we do it, we have to do it, it's part and parcel of the political agenda. But an enduring, right, a meaningful and reliable basis for social license, I don't think it can exist meaningfully in Australia in our current political and cultural environment. And I was going to put that forward on 4 major points. One, Duncan touched on, right? We don't know, because we don't know what we're granting license for. I'm going to say we, the royal we, both as citizen and as a, de facto member of the security community, we don't know what we're granting license for. And then if we don't know what we're agreeing to, it's pretty hard to derive a license from it. Secondly, we don't know the terms by which that license is given. Think of a driver's license, right? A driver's license doesn't simply allow you to drive. It is actually a contract. It's a notion of what you will and what you're qualified to do it. You will abide by certain rules. You've gone through certain, you've been rubber stamped, and now you can drive the car. Thirdly, we don't know what we're giving in return. Just like a driver's license, it's not simply the right to drive, it's the responsibilities that we hold in doing so. There's certain costs involved, and I don't believe the Australian public necessarily have a clear conception of what they're giving in return for that social license for national security. And fourthly, I think there's new challenges and expectations that exacerbate the previous 3 issues that I've outlined. When it comes to, what we don't know what we're granting license for, this is simply in what is national security. And I believe the policymakers in the audience, I would hope, would begrudgingly admit that it's a relatively fuzzy concept that suits us in a lot of ways. The academics don't get away scot-free at all, because there's a precious few in the world in the last however many years that have bothered to really interrogate what it is that they're studying. I think in many ways, and I'm happy to be put through the ringer for this, in many ways a lack of defining characteristics of national security helps us, both in policymaking and academia and in wider society. It has benefits, but it also has costs. I'm going to dwell too much on that and save the rest of my 5 minutes for things that I hope are a little bit less obvious. This lack of definition, though, means, and I'd hope that you'll all accept the premise that this means that national security and public discourse, sort of by necessity, is reactionary and contested. There's a bit of extra necessity, I'll admit, right? Security threats arrive rather suddenly, and we might want to deal with them just as suddenly. But even in more slow-burning issues, when we go to label something national security and how we deal with that moving forward, it becomes a roving feast as far as public discourse is concerned, largely because even in legislation, you can point to X amount of different times security appears in national legislation. Sometimes it's very specific. Sometimes it's, especially in the case of ministerial discretion, it's discretionary. So this is a problem. It's not just whinging about no definitions, right? Articulating why we need a license or what we're achieving with it. Now, we as the government, what we're achieving with it's extremely challenging. Now, if I ask, Duncan, actually, can we pause the timer? And I just want to give a little shout out. Now, Duncan, in his right mind, is never going to say yes.
I will take the mute off this in a moment.
Right? Because he has no idea what he's agreeing to. Now, not only am I just saying hi, mum, or I'm going to go on a 10-minute diatribe about, some obscure cause célèbre that's, close to my heart. Now, he doesn't know what it is that I'm dealing with. Now, imagine if I made that same request of Duncan, but I said at a talk in the distant future on a stage, I will ask that. Right? We now have no context. Right? We now have no terms for the granting of license, and I think that is the next step. Not what security is, be damned. Right? I'm going to put it to you that in the Australian context, what the terms of social license are is muddy, right? License is not just about letting you do something, but it's also about the terms by which and for which that act may occur. Back to the driving analogy. I don't just drive the car, I have rights and responsibilities in driving the car, and I've gone through certain hoops. I've got an agreement with the government about how I'm going to operate that vehicle, bless you. This license, let's boil it down to contract. We're talking about a social contract. Really? Yes.
5 minutes.
Wow. Australia has a confused relationship to social contract, especially when it comes to our political institutions. I won't go into a bit. I'm happy to answer questions about this, but by and large, the way that we have formulated Australia's political institutions has a bit of a confused history. There's two notions of social contract that's very popular in the English-speaking language, right? Thomas Hobbes, John Locke. Hobbes says, give up your choice for certainty. Locke says, abide by rules, and we'll guarantee you rights. Australia has historically problematic relationships, or it's torn between two. We have popularly voted for the Constitution. We then put in that Constitution assumptions that are less Lockean. We're jammed between these two things. So that means that we don't know what we're giving in return for when we agree to the social contract. Are we getting certainty from the government that we just matter-of-factly empower and say, well, you just keep things safe and I'll do what you say? Or are we getting rights? Is national stability ensured to maintain our capability or to safeguard the rights of citizens? Now, you might want both and you might think that we need both or that they're both related, but what justifies any particular national security act? And I think realistically, we're often in Hobbesian territory. We often just say, do it. Yeah, except we can't actually back it up. And put simply, how are we going to agree to national security if, as far as rights are concerned, if we don't actually know what our rights are? Basically, a lack of a Bill of Rights. I'll just wrap it up by saying this essentially goes to what the panel's, I think, spoken to more broadly. But the new challenges and expectations that exacerbate these issues, like climate, like social cohesion, which I prefer to say is the realisation of pluralism, that both of these exacerbate what national security is in the term of climate and how it is that we grant licence in the term of pluralism. I think, how we get into that, happy to take questions. But thank you.
James, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll now turn to you, the audience. It's a chance to put some of your questions to the panel. You've heard a wide range of views and thoughts there on what social licence is or is not, and we can move very quickly into these questions. I'm going to sort of take it by thirds. So are there questions on the right-hand side? It's hard to see up there against the rail. I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Could you please expand more on...
I'm sorry, could you... I didn't ask before, but would you mind just giving your name and any affiliation before you pop the question? Thank you.
Oh, sorry. My name's Unity. I work in the office of Zoe McKenzie in Federal Parliament. I was just really interested in the concept before of social cohesion being the realisation of pluralism. Could you expand more on that?
That's me. Is that me?
James, that's you.
That's me.
But can you expand briefly?
Yes, briefly. Oh,
a brief expansion.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. Pluralism, I think social cohesion assumes that we want some monolithic this is back to, I think, Lee's point, and I think Lisa as well, right? That we want some monolithic notion of society. And that's exactly sort of a Hobbesian notion of social contract. We want a general will to fuel the Leviathan. Whereas, I think we're in the situation we're in because of liberal democracy, where we say each individual snowflake is important and valued. And that's a good thing. But that means diversity of opinion and diversity of interests and identities. So I think by calling it social cohesion, we're hoping to jam a very amorphous thing into a particular shaped box. By calling it pluralism, we're identifying that these are actually our values have created this. And if we want to properly realize it, we should probably pay deference to that. Brief enough?
Would any of the other board members like to elaborate on that? Were you happy to press on? Lisa, did you want to say something?
Well, only to be contrarian. I actually like the word social cohesion as opposed to pluralism. No offence to pluralism, go pluralism. But I think if you are going to articulate, and create social license with a broad section of the population, a lot of them are not going to understand pluralism. If you talk to them about social cohesion, about society cohesively coming together on a shared set of values, of interests that are for the betterment of society and the nation as a whole, through the range of areas of national security we've touched on today, then people are going to bounce to that and give some sort of more feedback. And I think that's just a slight difference between perhaps an ex-politician talking and an academic talking. But, there is a skill in talking to a diverse range of people. And parliamentarians get quite good at it over time, those that have very diverse communities. There is a skill, and you do have to find a common language that is going to resonate with people to make them feel like they are part of the conversation. And I think social cohesion does that.
It's interesting that Christian made the comment that the issue of social license doesn't appear in the Finnish lexicon, but this issue of a two-way exchange of information and views, a communication and an understanding is obviously a theme that's running throughout here. I'm going to move now to the central sort of panel here, and I'll take some questions. Ma'am, in the white shirt, just... It's very hard to see from here.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm from DFAT.
I'm sorry?
Hannah.
Hi, Hannah.
From DFAT. I'm just interested in the panel's views about whether Australians genuinely have the power to revoke social licence. So I think I've heard Australians described as obedient, which I don't think is a term necessarily that we like, but we saw in the COVID lockdowns and vaccine programs that we did generally cooperate with what the government's asking us to do. But with things like the AUKUS nuclear subs, it's generally quite unpopular, but it's got bipartisan support, so it's going to go ahead probably regardless of what Australians think. So what's the metric, I suppose, for Australians to be able to revoke a social licence?
Hannah, thank you very much. Di, would you like to take a stab at this?
Yeah, look, I think during COVID, our community out in Fowler, I think, experienced the worst lockdown. Like, our community was just so angry. They followed, we have rules, regulations and laws that restrict people, and my community are very compliant, being migrants and refugees who've escaped war-torn countries and governments and tyrannical governments. So that there was a very sense of, while they followed, there was a sense of anger. And I think that anger then translated into election. Obviously, me being the first ever independent MP to be elected, was the people revoking, saying we do not agree with what you guys did. And even though my election was in 2022 and the whole COVID period was between 2020, 21, that continued on. From that respect, there was not revoking, but there was that reaction to that thing. In terms of AUKUS, there's a lot of not so much anger, but frustration in the community, in my community, who is saying, why are we spending that money when first of all, the technology will not be there, and that's what I've said in a few decades' time. And the second thing is that there are more needs that we need to address, prioritize, rather than spending. There are other ways to do defense rather than building a nuclear submarine, for instance. So, yeah.
It's very interesting. I'll get James to make a comment in a moment, but it is interesting when you think about Australians' reaction and response to COVID and I think you were saying, Hannah, the relative compliance, and whether that would happen again if we were to have another pandemic next year. Would the same degree of compliance occur? And how does that translate across to our understanding about social licence in a national security sense? So I think there is something to be thought about and drawn out of that. But James?
Oh, look, just interesting question on two levels. Firstly, on how compliant are we? I mean, entirely too compliant. I was very concerned during COVID when the Army were deployed on the streets of Sydney. It was appalling for two reasons. One, they were deployed with no more legal authority on the street than you, me, a Boy Scout, a Girl Guide, a volunteer lifesaver. They had no more legal authority than that. They were simply volunteers who were being used to round out logistics and police and contact tracing and that sort of thing. The New South Wales government could have deployed volunteer surf lifesavers and achieved the same result. But the police minister at the time, who was a mate of mine and who I spoke to privately about this at the time, was using language as if they'd been deployed to maintain law and order, which is a very different legal role. And I thought it was very dangerous the way some of our politicians talked about using the military to enforce social order during COVID. I saw politicians tweeting that the military should be used to put down protests against vaccinations, the Western Sydney example. So from my perspective, there wasn't nearly enough discussion or debate on that at the time, and I haven't really seen enough discussion or debate on that afterwards. On AUKUS, I think it's really interesting that you say it's as if it's universally unpopular. A lot of the conversations I have, it's immensely popular because 368 billion, you put any government policy over 10 years, it's going to be an eye-watering number. If that's what it costs us to have a game-changing technology which can secure us against China, people are very happy for that. I think as we're starting to get into the detail of what AUKUS looks like, whether it's going to be delivered at all, what timeline, what the sovereignty considerations will be, I think we're starting to see a much more, a little bit of concern, a little bit of skepticism. As we start to see some of the increased restrictions on the citizenships you can hold in sensitive roles in government, that will come as a result of tying ourselves more closely to the US industrial base. That will also spark a range of discussions around sort of social license and norms and what we're prepared to do and what we're not prepared to do. So as we see the detail of AUKUS coming, we're seeing a little bit more kind of dissent about whether that's the right path for us.
Hannah, thank you for that question. I'll take one more from the centre and then I'll go across to the right here. So I'm looking, sir, on the outside row there. Thank you.
Hi, is this on? Yep. It's Pat from Defence here. Just a question for Christian, actually primarily, but I was just interested in your comments on the Finnish example, I guess, of approaching the notion of national security, where the citizens are not just informed of objectives, but it's more of a participatory model. So two things to that. Could you maybe just give some examples of that, how that actually works in practice in Finland? Secondly, how do you think Australia could, I guess, have some lessons from that?
Thank you, Christian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question as well. So I really want to already as well sort of get into sort of challenging that top-down approach, that is the sort of traditional approach to national security, and really provoke by arguing that in this sort of sudden, unexpected shocks or transformational moments, there's never going to be enough. So if you take that sort of compliance or acceptance approach to national security, they may work well as the world sort of develops in a way that you have anticipated, and the threats and the risks sort of progress in a linear manner. But when you get these sort of unexpected shocks, with good luck with that sort of approach, people are compliant. With bad luck, they're not compliant, but in any case, you're not gonna get really them to sort of contribute towards solving that problem. One example maybe might be sort of to expand on that, what I said earlier on. So basically, what happened after Russia's invasion of Ukraine was that Sweden abandoned its neutrality, or its non-alignment policy that it had held for 200 years, and Finland a similar policy they had held for decades. And that change really, it wasn't top-down, okay, it wasn't bottom-up either, but it was sort of a combination of the two. So what actually played quite sort of significant part in the whole process was two citizenship initiatives in Finland. So citizenship initiatives basically work in a way that a group of people get together with a policy initiative. They gather 50,000 signatures. If they get 50,000 signatures and submit that to the parliament has to vote for it. So the old-fashioned way would have been, I guess you could say, the parliament had the social license through liberal democracy, so through elections, and they could have sort of taken the lead. But instead, a great number of the population thought that no, this is a situation that is actually urgent. We need to take urgent action. This is the direction we want things to go, and please have a look at this and determine whether. Based on your social license as parliamentarians, you agree. If it would have been just top down, I can almost assure you, it probably would have taken years. If it would have been bottom up, it probably would have taken forever. So I don't know if that was a good example, but and then COVID, a little bit same, I think. Obviously, we also implemented lockdowns in the early stage and gave them up pretty quickly. One of the reasons for being able to do that was that, again, there was a lot of sort of civil society organizations that took an active role, an active lead on COVID and implementing measures in elderly care homes, for instance, and hospitals and communities that sort of allow the government not to use the lockdown method for quite long. Yeah, that's a bit simplifying. It was a more complex situation than that, but maybe, yeah. So maybe that would be my answer at this point.
Kristen, thank you. I'll move across to the left-hand side of the room as I see it now. Ma'am, in the front.
Thanks. My name's Bridie. I'm from the Development Intelligence Lab. James, you kicked off talking about social license for national security as how do we get the public to pay for war and give license to kill. We flipped over with a little bit of whiplash to Lisa, who was talking about accountability, diversity, cohesion, and government's role consulting. And Kristen, you've pushed us further, saying that this is not top-down at all. This is something else. Are we talking in parallel universes? And if so, then how on earth do we resolve that so our government can act?
Well, there's a question. I'm not quite sure where to start here.
I'll have a very quick go.
Okay.
Yeah, in the Australian context, and this is where I was sort of settling in stealth, was start with the Bill of Rights, which might seem counterproductive. But if you want to talk about bringing people along for the ride, whether you're talking about top down or bottom up, at least we've set a relationship in stone between the government and the people. Because currently Australia, I was talked very briefly about Australia's confused institutions because of this confused notion of which social contract it really wants to engage with. There's good reason. There's a good reason that you always talk about implied rights in the Constitution, because they are implied. Yeah. So settling that in some sort of fundamental bedrock would at least allow people some notion of what they're giving up and how to move forward. Because I think it's true that we will flip. You will get whiplash between it, because that might be the realities of the strategic situation or the tactical situation. But at least if we've got some common bedrock on which people can rely, then at least they can go in with both eyes open.
Can I just quickly continue? Yes. Yeah. Again, I'm not really implying that it's only bottom-up approach either. It's more like that. Most of esteemed colleagues here have talked about that. It's this sort of two-directional process that is a living process, because the threat environment is changing dynamically. The societies are changing dynamically. So what we're trying to protect and against what is in constant change. We need to have this sort of living process, I think. And each society does it in its own way. There's, like I said earlier on, there's of course this sort of geographic, geostrategic, historical, cultural reasons why we may have chosen some different paths. And don't want to go too much into maybe why that happened there, but obviously there, are these sort of experiences or crises in societies that should teach us how do we want to approach things. And in general, I think I've been quite disappointed everywhere in the world that we may not have actually taken those lessons from COVID. So if we talk about that, I don't know if people in Australia next time would like to be locked up for either shorter or longer period of time or at all. And it really depends in terms of how do we value that experience. Do we want to change it somehow? And how do we do that?
Christian, I rode in a taxi this morning in Melbourne to the airport, and the taxi driver shared with me how much he enjoyed the lockdowns in Melbourne. I won't describe the colourful language that was used. I'll go over to the right-hand side again. Anybody in that block with a question? If not, sir in the white shirt.
Thanks very much. I'm interested from anyone on the panel to maybe have a think about, in a potential conflict scenario or a national security crisis, what the role of the media and journalism and I guess private industry as well plays in that, in terms of that, it is a controversial statement a few years ago. Prime Minister Abbott used, Team Australia, and that got a lot of media attention. But I'm interested in what you guys view as the role of the media and private industry in that sort of scenario.
Di, I wonder if I might, with your background, ask you to start the ball rolling on that one, and then we'll see where it takes us.
Sure. Look, as a former journalist, I think the media role is very important to inform the community, but having that real, facts and two sides. I always believe, being a trained as a journalist at the ABC, you always have two sides to the story. There's always two sides to this coin. I think the challenge today, and I think I mentioned this to Duncan, the challenge today that we're facing is the different platforms of social media, and traditional media. Print, of course, is dying. We're moving more into digital, and then our television and radio are kind of the traditional. It's still, giving us news. However, I think everybody in this room and the young people nowadays are just so engaged. They don't turn to traditional media anymore. So then, how do you actually provide information to the population? The source of truth. Where is the source of truth? That is the challenge. But I think it's about, for me as a parliamentarian, I'm trialing out different platforms to ensure that my message and the government's message is being sent out, because we can't just rely on one traditional media like we used to anymore. So that's I think that's a challenge in the future for government, or for business as well, and for anyone.
Any other panel members like to comment?
Just on the look, I think amongst the media cohort, there's a much more sophisticated understanding of national security now than there was 5-10 years ago. You're seeing more coverage of national security issues, which is appropriate given the provenance and the prominence of them, and the increase in spending. On the role of industry, Home Affairs didn't talk about it a lot today, but they're doing a lot of early work with industry to think through what conflict might look like. With some of the critical infrastructure protection legislation that's been passed, Home Affairs has the right, when a threat arises, to put their code into your software and systems. The first time they started having conversations like that with some of my colleagues in the space industry, they were pretty shocked about that. But that has been a two-way discussion that I think has been really important. We're a little bit underdone, I think, is a discussion with the banking and finance sectors about what sort of role they would play in the event of a major conflict. The last time we had to face this in World War II, it was a very different economic and financial system. In the tragic and event that you end up in a major war, one of the first responsibilities and one of the first things a national government needs to think about is how do you stop rampant price hikes, exploitation and profiteering. In the Second World War, that was all done through the Commonwealth Bank. They just got them to set up a bunch of boards for each commodity, each industry, each resource, to regulate the price, to manage supply, to ration, all that sort of stuff. It's not clear where that would happen in our current government or economy, and I hope there's someone busily beavering away on that problem somewhere in defence, just in case the worst happens.
James, thank you. I'm sorry we are kind of running perilously close to time here. I do want to take the moderator's privilege of making a comment here with regard to the nature of social licence as I see it. We had a comment made about AUKUS a few moments ago. The pulling the rabbit out of the hat with AUKUS and the surprise, if you like, the shock that created among many of the cognoscenti, but also the wider community, was quite interesting. I mean, I've been in the game long enough to know what the restrictions were on government around getting that deal done. That's all understood. But it is an interesting case study in how to sort of leave a community behind. But what concerns me is actually the more nuanced area in national security, which goes to James's last point. There is a whole bunch of community action and preparation that is required ahead of conflict, or as conflict might even be in prospect, even at some distance. And I don't think there is anywhere near the understanding in the community at present about the nature of that preparation and the extent of it and how it would impact on them. I am pleased to say that I've been required to turn my attention to this in the last sort of 5 or 6 months, doing some work with government. I have been astonished that almost every federal government department and agency that I have visited, even those least likely to have an interest in this matter, have got little cells inside the department that are looking at national security interests. And that extends to the Department of Education, the issue of the financial agencies that you've spoken about, and so on. So I think we are moving the ball forward on social licence, but my sense is we've got a long way to go. Now, I'm sorry we are running out of time here. We're not going to be able to take any further questions. I did promise Rory we would finish right on time. I mentioned this morning we are running this conference a little bit like a German rail system, and we do have a dinner to go to this evening. Could I take the opportunity to say that you've had a broad range of views from the panellists this afternoon, and I would like, on behalf of the audience, to thank the panellists for their contribution. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank you, the audience. This is the first of these conferences that the National Security College has run. I think it has been, certainly at the end of the first day, a fantastic opportunity for people to express views, to understand views of others. These conversations need to continue. The roadshow that Lisa spoke of earlier, that Rory is going to take the conversation out into the community, it's something that I've been very keen to do for a long time, and I think we are heading in the right direction here. So look, thank you very much. It's the end of a long day. Enjoy the dinner tonight, and I look forward to seeing you all at the various sessions tomorrow. Thank you very much.